Good morning, everybody. It's a Sunday morning and it's 9 o'clock, and it's 9 o'clock is always with me, Father Warner. We are in the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Our text today is a very interesting text taken from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. And I've entitled today's teaching, The End of the World. When will that happen? Now, straight away, I want to recommend that you please like these videos. It's very important that you do it. We invest a lot of time in these videos. So please like them, please share them, and please pass on your comments also. We'd love to hear from you. But subscribe to this channel if you haven't, and share these videos with your friends. Remember, this evening I'll also be doing at 4 p.m. Why Do Catholics? And I'll tell you what the topic is when we finish today's teaching. But here we are. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nations will rise against nations, and kingdoms against kingdoms, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But not a hair of your head will perish. But your endurance, and by your endurance, you will gain your souls." Now, straight away, when we read verse 5, we know that Jesus is talking to his disciples in the temple. We know that Jesus entered Jerusalem in chapter 19, and then he cleanses the temple. In chapter 20, they question him about his authority. We did this last Sunday in our teaching. So Jesus is talking to his disciples in the temple, which is where he has been teaching since the beginning of chapter 20. Now, Jesus is, in chapter 21, he's seated opposite the treasury, from where he observed. If you look just above this text, you will see that there's chapter 21 begins with verses 1 to 4, with Jesus observing a widow who literally threw her whole life saving into this temple treasury. Now, overhearing someone speak of the grandeur of this temple and their fascination for things seen, Jesus then predicts its destruction. Now, the disciples, like us, are very piqued in our curiosity when somebody says, "Oh, the church of St. Stephen is going to be destroyed." Everybody's going to turn around and say, like, "Really? When? How? Why?" So the next thing that the disciples want from Jesus, as you can see in today's text, is they wanted timeline. No? When is this going to happen, Lord? Perhaps a chart or a timetable to be read, to read these predictions, down to the last second. When is this going to happen, Lord? Now, it is this scenario that Jesus speaks of. In this scenario, he's going to speak of what we call the end times, which is taken up in the study of eschatology. Okay, always place a text in its context, because once you understand why Jesus said what he said about the temple and why he speaks of the end times, and in what context. In the context of sitting at the temple, watching a widow put all her savings, people not focusing on the savings but the beauty of external beauty, and Jesus wants to draw attention to a greater point, put it in a context. Now, our text of today forms part of a larger narrative which begins in began in verse 5, and it continues till verse 38. This is the entire pericope. A word pericope means a short or a small cutting out. So these verses from 5 to 38 must be read as one text. Now, Jerusalem has not only rejected the heeding of God's prophets, but we know also they have rejected the teachings of Jesus. And as a consequence, Jerusalem will come to face the consequences. You see, by the time that St. Luke put the finishing touches on these verses in the Gospel of Luke, the temple had already been a smoldering ruin which had been razed to the ground by the Romans. We know that this disaster that Jesus has forecasted in today's text had already taken place in the year 70 AD. Luke is writing this many years later. Now, looking back at the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, this larger text that we are looking at also stands in a way as a vindication of the rejected Son of Man, and also it was written as a means to strengthen the disciples who follow Jesus and who, as Jesus says, will also face similar rejection because of their allegiance to him. So essentially, and to put it very in much easier words, Jesus is warning us about what is to come, but most importantly, he wants us to realize that it will take, he wants us to realize what will it take us to prepare for his coming. So Jesus today moves from discussing a specific catastrophic event, that is the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, to more general statements and comments about the coming of false prophets, the coming of wars and other calamities, and we saw this in verses 7 to 12. Now, if you see this whole text, it kind of disturbs you, because Luke employs language and imagery that is that was very conventional in what we call apocalyptic literature. From tomorrow onwards, for the next 2 weeks, we are going to do the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature. Yeah. So apocalyptic literature uses very unsettling language and imagery as a means to assure the faithful that they should keep their trust in God even when they are facing the most challenging of circumstances. Please let me say this as an introduction to what I'm going to teach you tomorrow, that apocalyptic literature is not written for us to find clues in a book to reveal what's going to happen. Yeah, in the book of Revelation, you will see often Rome and the 7 hills mentioned. Yeah, there are silly people who say that Babylon is Rome today. Yeah, and God is going to destroy Rome. Now, these people have no understanding of history, they have no understanding of apocalyptic literature, they have no understanding why the book of Revelation was written. They see the devil in all places and they love to frighten everyone. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. That's a fact. When the disciples asked, Lord, when is all this going to happen? Look at Jesus' response. You be ready. You simply be ready. We're going to start the season of Advent, which is what? A reminder to be ready. Now, so coming back, you realize that every generation since Jesus died on the cross has thought that theirs was the last generation. And here's the ironic thing, none of them were right, because we're still all living. So worry and doubt distract us, and listen to this, worry and doubt distract us from the most important job of spreading the gospel message. And this is the sum and substance of what Jesus wants to teach us today. He says, will the world come to an end? Will there be all of this? See how wonderfully he says it. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first. Will they take place? Jesus says, yes, they will take place. But the end will not follow immediately. Yeah. So every time people say, oh, there's a war in Ukraine and some crypto company has just crashed and financial markets have crashed and there is an earthquake somewhere and something that shouldn't have happened, end of the world. Really? Jesus himself said, these things will take place, but the end will not follow immediately. So sure enough, while describing these terrible events, Jesus obviously tells his listeners, please, he says in verse 9 of chapter 21, he says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Yeah? The point of this teaching is be ready, not to be afraid. The point of most Pentecostal teachers is to instill fear in you, not readiness when the Lord will call you. Yeah? That is what we should be focusing on. Am I ready? So the disciples were, as Jesus said, to be brought before kings and rulers who would question them about their faith in Jesus. Now, in the immediate context, who were these people who would bring them before kings and rulers? The Jews would disown and betray these Christians to the Romans. We know this as a historical fact. The actual word that is used here in today's text, they will hand you over. This verse in verse 12, they will hand you over, is the same Greek word used to describe Judas's betrayal of Jesus. Yeah, as well as the same word is used at the handing over of Jesus to Pilate. They will hand you over, you will be betrayed. So this act on the part of the Jews was in fact a betrayal of a fellow Israelite to a foreigner, something that was forbidden in Jewish law. Yet, the disciple was to bear witness, a witness that would bring, as it does, tension, sometimes separation from parents and family, friends and relations, and some of them would even be put to death. So Jesus is giving them practical advice to deal with adversity. For this adversity was, for Jesus, your adversity when you are brought before kings was to be an opportunity to share the good news and to testify to Jesus. See that in verse 13. So just as God gave Moses and other prophets the capacity to speak, to confront their doubters and opponents, you see this in the book of Exodus, in the book of Jeremiah, Jesus himself will provide strength and wisdom for such testimony. Now, using a proverb that signifies divine protection, Jesus therefore tells them, listen, I will not allow one hair on your head to perish. Now, despite its language and the imagery of destruction that we see in Luke chapter 21 verse 5 to 19, the text of today, Luke is ultimately, this passage that Luke is communicating, this passage is ultimately grounded in hope. In the hope that God remains present in the world and in our lives, even when things have gotten so bad that it feels like the world is closing in on us. Now, it's been noted that when circumstances which may be really hard befall people, people tend to want to avoid it. The truth is that we waste more energy trying to avoid it rather than preparing for it. And Jesus helps counter that. Talk about the end times is the kind of news many of us may want to avoid. Very simple. Ask somebody, are you ready for your death? Or sometimes I say, if I die, people say, Father, please don't talk about these things. Hello, are you preparing for that? You see, what is to come will come. You can't change that. And if we listen, we will understand that Jesus isn't giving us information about our death and when it will happen. He is providing words of preparation. Now, as disciples, we may be anxious to know what signs should we look out for when the end time comes. But the timing of such an event really is God's secret. We have seen many of the signs written in this piece of scripture, what is mentioned today, happen already in the 21st century. It doesn't mean that the world has ended. Jesus warns, therefore, about the silliness of following so many gurus, those who claim to know when the end is coming. It is easy in times of distress or when people are terrified, it's easy for people, and understandable sometimes, for people to look for someone to show the way. But please understand this, that Jesus is the way. He is the truth. He is the life. On a lighter note, when I was in the year 2000, they were predicting that the world will come to an end. Remember this? They said the Y2K, and they said planes would, computer glitches would cause planes to fall from the sky, etc., etc. And one charming lady came to me and said to me, "Father," she said, "the world is going to come to an end." I said, "Really? How do you know?" She said, "Very simple." She said, "Look at all the pictures of Jesus. I've got one there. I'm looking at it." She says, "If you look at Jesus' fingers, he's got two fingers up like this." Yeah? And she said, "That's a sign that it's going to end in the year 2000. Now, I didn't want to waste my time getting into a needless discussion. So I said to her, I said, "Madam, you are convinced," I said, "that the world is going to come to an end in the year 2000. "Yes, Father, I'm convinced," she said. I said, "Okay, can you give me a check dated the 1st of January 2000 in which you transfer everything, including your house and your wealth, to me? Since you are convinced that the world is going to come to an end, you have no need of all of this. Make sure it is dated 1st of January. Guess what? I never got the check. Put your money where your mouth is. Yeah? But don't go around simply disturbing people. What is the point that Jesus is making? Will the world come to an end? Yes. Will he come again? Yes. Will there be the final judgment? Yes. Do we know when? No. Why should we not know when? Because that's for only God to know. He says it very clearly. The time and that place, only my Father in heaven knows. It's not our business to know. What is our business? And with that, let me end. What is our business? Our business is to prepare. Okay? So, this week we are going to start studying the book of Revelation from tomorrow at 9 o'clock. It's not an easy book, may I warn you. At times I struggled with the book myself. Also, it's got more than 20 chapters. So, what's going to happen is that we're going to jump sections. It's great if you start reading the book of Revelation. Just read through it so that when we study it each day, you get a greater understanding of this book of Revelation. So I'm going to see you again this evening, just in case you forgot. It's a Sunday, so we do a catechesis session at 4 o'clock, and we're going to do a very simple, less than 4 minutes. Why do Catholics use bells, in our liturgy? And then I'll see you again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Bye, everybody. Have a lovely, lovely Sunday. I'm wearing mustard yellow, which tells you I'm relaxed today.